Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rena Arsenault, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's presentation on religion and intimate partner violence. This presentation is a collaboration between the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre for Family Violence Research. And we're excited to be partnering with them to provide information on this important topic. So that everybody knows, today is the last day of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which is an international campaign to challenge violence against women and girls. So today is the last day of this 16 days of activism. Before I introduce our speakers, all the housekeeping details you need, like how to access a recording, where to download the slides, and how to get your certificate of attendance are all included in the housekeeping widget that pop up when you first logged in. With that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. The Religion and Violence Research Team has been conducting collaborative, action-oriented social science research for almost 25 years. The result of numerous quantitative and qualitative studies with religious leaders, congregations, survivors, perpetrators, shelter workers, therapeutic professionals, and criminal justice personnel are the basis for the RAVE, Religion and Violence e-learning website. The webinar will highlight the resource available to assist social workers to better understand the lives of religious victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence. The key message is that religious beliefs and practices can be used to manipulate and control victims and justify violence, but they can also be harnessed in assisting survivors who seek safety and healing, as well as call perpetrators to account for their actions. They argue that the consideration of religion is an important element of a collaborative community response to intimate partner violence. Our two presenters today is Dr. Nancy Nason-Clark. Nancy is a professor of sociology at the University of New Brunswick and the academic leader of the Religion and Violence Research Team at the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre. Her most recent book is Religion and Intimate Partner Violence, Understanding the Challenges and Proposing Solutions. Dr. Catherine Altman is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick and the Director here at the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Centre. Her research focuses on the intersection between religion, ethnicity, and gender in studies of intimate partner violence. So with that said, I will turn the microphone over to Kathy and Nancy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Nancy here, and I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to share with you a little bit about our research on religion and intimate partner violence, and we're going to be introducing you to our website that Rena had just mentioned, and thank you, Rena, for that nice introduction. I think what I'd like to say first off is that about 25 to 30 years ago, I began thinking about the question, what happens when a religious woman or man or teenager or child goes to their faith leader for help in the aftermath of domestic violence? What is the story and how does it unfold? And how does it unfold from a variety of perspectives? And so over the last 25 plus years, I've been involved with a whole variety of people, the names of some of those you see on the screen who've worked with me as graduate students or as colleagues on a whole variety of studies related to religion and intimate partner violence. And I just want to acknowledge that this work takes a lot of money as well, and so we are very thankful to those who have funded our research. As a very quick overview of some of our work so that you can begin to understand why we argue and how we argue the various things we believe are related to religion and intimate partner violence, they're based on the studies that we've conducted. And so first of all, we've conducted a variety of quantitative studies. And as you all know, quantitative studies are those ones where there's a broad snapshot of a very large number of people. So you're skimming the surface, but you're doing that with a relatively large number of people. And in our case, we've done clergy surveys of 5 different denominations, and there we were looking to try to understand a bit more fully what is their experience in dealing with domestic violence and intimate partner violence, what kinds of advice do they offer, what kind of knowledge do they have, and what kind of resources do they access in the community when they do so. We've also been involved in batterer intervention program case files, and there we've looked at over 1,000 closed case files from various agencies to understand what happens in those cases where there is some expressed interest in or identification with a religious group. Does the trajectory of how that case is assessed and dealt with, and the follow-through is different or not, and I'll be speaking about that a little bit later. And then we've also looked at seminary students. What kinds of training do they have that relates to intimate partner violence, and what is their knowledge and understanding of it? The qualitative studies are where you dig rather deep, but you do it with a more confined number of people. You're asking a whole broad variety of questions to try to understand more fully what is the understanding and knowledge and interaction between those who are working in faith-based agencies or those who are faith-based workers themselves working in a congregational context, both with those whose lives are impacted by intimate partner violence or are working with others like yourselves who are working with those whose lives are impacted by intimate partner violence. And so there we've done clergy interviews to understand how the stories often unfold, at what point do people look to their religious leaders for help, and then what do those religious leaders actually do as they begin to interact with men and women whose lives have been impacted by domestic violence, either as victim survivors or as those who've actually perpetrated the violence. We've been engaged in focus groups, and those are often in a congregational setting where we look at how do congregations respond to those who highlight that they have this the experience of domestic violence in their lives, and what kinds of resources do those congregations bring to bear. And then we've done interviews with abusers. This was a big study we started several years ago where for a 4-year period, every 6 months, we interviewed a group of 55 men post-incarceration as they were involved in a batterer intervention program. And we were trying to understand more fully how do they narrate their own story of the downward vortex into domestic violence and then their journey towards accountability and change in its aftermath. And then worker interviews. And that's where we've interviewed people who are working in various agencies, criminal justice agencies, therapeutic agencies, advocacy agencies, to understand about their relationship with those who are in congregational life or those who are religious leaders. And then just this year, we've been engaged in a series of follow-up studies where we've been trying to understand 25 years later, what are some of the changes? What has occurred in the meantime, and how have things altered over the years that we've been doing research in this particular area?
Hello, we're back. I hope everyone can hear me. Sorry about that. Our phone kicked out here. This is Kathy Holtman, and so I'm going to take up where Nancy left off. And I'm going to talk to you about one of the resources that we've developed as part of the Religion and Violence e-learning website. This is what we call the stained glass story of abuse. And as Nancy mentioned, over the 25 years, we've spoken with many, many survivors of intimate partner violence, and they've told us their stories. And this visual imagery that we're about to present to you is based on these stories that we've heard over the 25 years. And I think it's important for you to understand that when we speak of religious survivors of intimate partner violence, one of the things you need to keep in mind is that religious women, no matter what their religious or faith background, are no more or less likely to experience intimate partner violence than anyone else in the population. I think there's a pervasive stereotype out there that women from particular religious groups may be more likely to report experiences of intimate partner violence, and we have no evidence to support such thinking. And so in Canada, we're looking at rates of intimate partner violence across a woman's lifetime at about 30%, and that's in line with global estimates as well. And so women come from a variety of backgrounds, a variety of religious traditions, and what we've done is we've put together, working together with professional stained glass artists from Cranberry Glass Studios, a stained glass picture or stained glass portrait of the story of abuse. And so it begins with the picture of the whole stained glass. As you see in the beginning, there is beauty, there's connection, and there's lots of diversity within religious families. Every family member is different, and the stained glass window represents connections between them, connections of faith, connections of love, connections of caring for one another. The web of relationships that we call family brings together people into intimate relationships with one another. And in the beginning, there is peace. What happens with the onset of intimate partner violence is that violence strikes and creates chaos amongst this peaceful picture. The glass is shattered and there are many broken pieces. Life is never the same again. In the aftermath of intimate partner violence, there is pain and brokenness, disconnection and isolation. For religious survivors of intimate partner violence, there's a great deal of guilt and shame. Therefore, they are very hesitant to disclose or even to recognize that intimate partner violence is happening in their family and destroying their dream of a happy family life. Thus, the impact is felt throughout the entire family, and it's affecting all members of the family unit. The process of rebuilding after intimate partner violence strikes the family home in religious families is a long and undetermined process. We can't say how this will unfold in any individual's life, but we know some general things about it. We know that the broken pieces of a religious woman's faith and of her family background need to be rebuilt. And this involves a process of, first of all, understanding what is happening and naming what is happening as intimate partner violence, and then figuring out what needs to be done in order to seek safety for herself and for her children, and then to begin to make sense of what's happened to her. And so the making sense of what happens to her is about taking those pieces of a shattered life, those jagged pieces that are rough to the touch and that are sources of pain, and making sense of them again, reshaping them, reconfiguring them, resetting them into a new portrait. In the renewal process, what we see is that beauty is born out of brokenness, and that there is hope for a new life, a life built upon the old life, but a life that is forever changed. As that life is starting to be reconstructed, we see that a white dove emerges with wings outstretched. And this, for many Christians, represents spiritual strength and hope. And particularly, we want to focus on the resiliency of religious survivors and the resources within their faith traditions that can help them to rebuild their life and give them hope that they can heal and that they can live lives that are free from violence. And so this image of the dove and the language of religious groups, the language which we refer to as language of the Spirit, brings hope and strength to survivors and their families. Then we have the pain that illustrates that there are new beginnings, that a new family portrait of stained glass emerges. Sometimes there's a resemblance to the one before, but sometimes not. Individual pieces of glass, again, reflect diversity in how different family members deal with the implications of the situation of intimate partner violence in their lives. So stained glass, again, there's connection, but there's also diversity. And so this brings hope and the possibility of new beginnings.
One of the things we were very struck with in terms of our work with survivors and the stories of victims, particularly those for whom their faith was a really important part of their lives and their faith journey, a critical aspect of how they thought about themselves, was that they held out as a group great hope that if only their abuser would seek help, that change would occur. And in part, we heard this message so often that it propelled us to begin to think about how we could see if there was any evidence upon which that hope was placed, or whether, in fact, that hope was misplaced. And so we began to do work with religious perpetrators, men who had been convicted of domestic violence and who were part of a program, a matter intervention program, to help begin to shape their attitudes and to change and alter their behavior. And so as part of that, we wanted to understand their story. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that we interviewed a group of 55 men every 6 months over a 4-year period. And after we completed that work and published about it, we wanted to use, again, the motif of stained glass to portray what we were learning through that story. And what you see here is a stained glass portrait of men who batter. And you see the tree. The tree represents the man himself. And in this particular visual, your attention is drawn to the fact that the wind and the sun and the soil, the tree is responding to its environment. And that is true for the men we have interviewed, that a large part of their story has to do with the circumstances of their lives, very challenging often circumstances, but of course those circumstances do not excuse the abuse. We're focused here on the fact that the tree stands tall and that it is resilient despite the obstacles it faces from the climate. And the tree's strength reminds us that it is possible to overcome even very harsh circumstances. And that every one of us, male and female, those of us who've had easy childhoods and those of us who have not, we are all responsible for our own actions, and we are responsible to change those actions that are abusive when they occur. And what you see here is that there's a red streak running through the base of the tree and upward through the branches and out onto the leaves, and it reminds us that even the tender leaves show evidence of this reddish hue. Violence, of course, is learned behavior. And children bear the marks even if they themselves have not been the ones to which the violence is directed. And what we have learned from our research is that often women will say, I will leave a violent situation when the children are harmed. But the children are harmed when domestic violence happens and a woman is its victim. Here you see that the tree stands tall despite the obstacles from the environment. Kathy, yeah. And that day and night the violence occurs. So you see there's the sun and the moon representing the fact that it can happen, domestic violence can happen during the daylight, it can happen as well in the evening. And then here you see that some of the roots are already dead, but there's that little kernel. You see the green there? It's just a tiny sliver that there's always hope for change. The cycle can be broken. So basically what we've tried to show through the use of stained glass, both the stained glass story of abuse that Kathy referred to earlier and now this stained glass portrait of men, is to harness some of the what's familiar in a faith tradition to say that your faith community can be a source of assistance at the time of your greatest need. And we've used our research and the visuals in terms of the development of the RAVE website, which you, of course, are free to look at any time. And when this webinar is over, we're hoping that perhaps you'll go to our website and see the variety of resources that we have here. Right now on the screen, you see violence around the world, and this is one of the ways that we've tried to give information about violence in many different contexts, in many different countries. And what you simply do is you click on that part of the world that you're interested in having more information on, and then what you see is that once you double-click, up comes a more in-depth portrait of that country, and in this case it's Canada, but we have about 70 countries that are highlighted in different parts of the world, and you can see the most up-to-date information on those. We also have frequently asked questions, and here we list the questions. You see those on the left-hand side. And then over on the right, you see that we have different responses from theologians or therapists or researchers and so on. And the notion here is to build the idea that really knowledge about domestic violence and intimate partner violence is multidisciplinary. That if you're a police officer, you're going to respond to the question, what is abuse, differently than if you happen to be a researcher or a therapist or a pastor. And so the part of building capacity for religious leaders is to help them to see that it's very complicated, the idea of what is abuse or how can we respond, and we do that by bringing various voices into play. And again, you just see here asking a theologian how they would respond would be different than asking someone else from a different perspective. We also rely a lot on stories that have been come as a result of our research. And on this part of the website, you'll see there are profiles of DV leaders, there are voices of religious leaders, there are voices of victims, and then there's the stories of men who've acted abusively. And we often link these to our publications. This particular story, Vincent's story, comes from the book Men Who Batter that we've written based on our research. Then what's new, we have blogs, we have other ways of giving information about what's things that we're writing, things we're thinking about in terms of our work and how it impacts our website. We're always hoping to have new things so that if you look at the website today and you come back in another month or so and have a look at it again, you'll see that we've done a variety of different things. And our online training refers to a whole series of different things that you can look at on our website to get some in-depth understanding of either the issues of religion, If you happen to be a worker in a community-based agency and perhaps you're responding to those who are people of faith, then we have other training for those who are in religious congregations who are trying to understand more about the issue of domestic violence.
As you can see, there's a variety of resources in our online training section, and what we found to be really important is to provide online training, particularly for religious leaders who often are not or do not feel included in a community-coordinated response to intimate partner violence, but who also want more training because many of them have not had this kind of training specifically in their professional development. And so a couple of the things that I'll show you in terms of the online training, or that I want to draw your attention to, is that we give them stories from our data so that they can see how this unfolds in the lives of religious victims and perpetrators, and then look at a variety of responses to that. And so I also use some of these resources in terms of training for secular service providers who also don't understand the particulars of any religious tradition, or how a religious survivor of intimate partners violence might be experiencing sort of unique vulnerabilities. And so by reading through some of these stories, which we've used as the basis for our stained glass portraits, the details in these stories help to give you a better understanding of the kinds of questions that a religious survivor might be asking in the aftermath of violence, the kinds of support they need in terms of renegotiating their faith's understanding, working through some of their guilt and shame and doubt. And so those kinds of religious questions, religious renegotiations are what we feel are essential in helping move certain survivors forward and calling religious perpetrators of intimate partner violence to account. Another great resource that we offer on the website is a series of maps. And so they're under what we call the Help Now tab. And so we've put together maps of every province and every state in the United States and every province in Canada, which shows the relative locations of domestic violence shelters and transition houses. And this is to help, again, religious leaders and members of religious groups to be able to provide information to either family members or to friends or to people in their communities, or for religious survivors themselves to look up what resources are available in their communities. In particular, religious leaders need information about what's going on in their communities so that they too can refer survivors of intimate partner violence or perpetrators to the public services that they need in order to live violence-free lives. And so if you go into any of the maps, you'll see a series of shelters. So that highlights New Brunswick, where we are. And then if you click on any of the red dots, then it brings up the contact information for that shelter. Most often, we have a crisis line that is open 24/7, and then a link to their website, which gives more detailed information about the services offered at that particular shelter. And as I mentioned, we also have shelter maps for the United States as well. Finally, on the website, you have links to our bookstore, and so we've written at length about a lot of the things that Nancy and I have spoken to you today, obviously in greater detail. What I'd like to do to finish off with before we look to answer some of your specific questions is to talk about some of the challenges that we've seen when trying to include religion into a coordinated community response to domestic violence. For many years, I think, and maybe even still, the impression remains, particularly amongst domestic violence service providers, that religion is the problem when it comes to violence in families of faith. What we argue is that religion can be a source of the problems within a family that's experiencing violence, but it also can provide resources that can be harnessed in the journey to living violence-free. And so we feel that it's important to include religion in a collaborative community response. But there are some challenges to this. And so I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that are available. And I'm assuming some of you are part of community responses to domestic violence. And so I'd like you to think about perhaps the religious resources or the religious groups within your region and how they might contribute to a collaborative response to domestic violence. One of the important things to know is that there are usually a number of key individuals within any community who are able to be part of a collaborative response to domestic violence. And this is for sure the case within religious groups and among religious groups in a community. And so in our studies of different communities throughout North America, we've seen that within each community there are some religious leaders who have training and who understand the problem of intimate partner violence and are clear about their role and their strengths in a community response. But sometimes it's very difficult for them to connect with non-religious or secular service providers because of this assumption that religion can only be part of the problem. And so what I would suggest is that some homework needs to be done in every location to figure out who are the key players, who are the religious leaders who would be valuable in a community coordinated response. Who are the people who have training, or at least who are the people that are open to learning more and becoming closer partner in the community response to intimate partner violence? What our research has shown is that most often female religious leaders are those who tend to be more aware of the problem and more willing to address it. But that's not always the case, and sometimes there are very good male religious leaders who are more than willing to be part of such a response. I think on the part of public service providers, we have to remember that they need to do their part too in a collaborative response in terms of understanding the importance of religion to particular survivors and as well as perpetrators. Our society in Canada is becoming more and more religiously diverse. My own research is mostly with immigrant families, particularly Christian and Muslim families. And there are all sorts of misconceptions or misunderstandings or a lack of understanding about the religious diversity in our country. And so people have assumptions about religious groups and religious leaders that prevent them from really understanding what's going on within those communities. And so I think it's very important that service providers like yourself try to understand the religious diversity within your communities and become more familiar with the religious resources that exist within your communities as well. Another factor in establishing a community response to domestic violence that includes religion is the issue of trust. There needs to be respect for religion and religious diversity. It's an important component of identity and practice for many Canadians. And this is persistent despite the fact that there is a rising number of non-religious people in our country. There are also lots of people for whom religion is an important part of their daily life. As I said at the beginning, we have no evidence that people from particular religious traditions are any more or less likely to experience intimate partner violence than anyone else in the country. And so therefore we have to assume that there's equal rates of intimate partner violence within religious traditions, but there are also opportunities and resources that can be harnessed within those religious traditions to help victims move through what we've called that stained glass story of abuse towards a life that is free from violence and is part of a healing process. So on that last slide there, we have the URL for our website. It's recently overgone, it's had a facelift, and so we've tried to make it a little bit more accessible so you can access it on your iPads and your your Android phones as well as your desktop computers. And as Nancy mentioned, we try to add new content all the time. So we have a blog and we have social media as well, Facebook and Twitter, which we invite you to connect with and use some of those resources that we've talked about today.
Well, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I'm sure the audience is keen to get some question. And I do have a few questions, so I will ask the first one. The first one is twofold. The first I was asking, sorry if you get to this later, and it was written at the beginning of your presentation, but are devout or observant women more likely to remain in relationship in which there is or has been violence? And the second part to this question is, actually, the second part to that question, are religious couples more likely to be able to heal their relationship and continue on violence-free?
Well, to respond to the first about remaining, I think one of the vulnerabilities that needs to be recognized for deeply religious women is that they don't give up easily on their relationships. Now, that's true, of course, of all women, religious and non-religious women. I think it's important to say. But I think there are some specific challenges for deeply religious women to both look for help and then after looking for help to seek safety and refuge and to actually leave either temporarily or forever a relationship that is violent. And so that's why we believe it is so important for religious leaders to be part of the coordinated response, because we have found from deeply religious women, when the rabbi or the pastor or the priest says, you need to look after your own safety, this is what God is asking you, and you need to ensure the safety of your children, it is more impactful in the life of that woman than if a secular social worker alone gives that message. And so the coordinated community response increases the likelihood that the woman will be able to hear and act on the advice that she has been given or the support that she's been given. We also know that religious leaders have a very important role to play in calling those who act abusive to accountability and change. In one of our studies, we looked at the proportion of men, in this particular study it was men who had been mandated to be part of a batterer intervention program mandated by the courts. And we looked at how many actually followed through and completed the number of sessions that were part of that batterer intervention program. And about 60% of men who've been mandated by the criminal justice system to attend to completion a batterer intervention program actually do so. Amongst those men who were men of faith, when their religious leader cooperated with and gave additional support for completion, the numbers went up to almost 80% completing. So what that indicates to us is that when the religious leader is actively engaged in supporting the work of the secular society, the response rate is impacted by that.
I guess then I'll respond to the second half of that question as to whether couples can heal. I think similar to we don't have evidence that religious couples are more or less likely to report domestic violence. I think in a similar way, we can't say whether religious couples are more or less likely to heal. The reason why we advocate for including religion in a coordinated community response and as well for further training for religious leaders is I think that there is this sense that somehow because families are considered sacred and families are at the heart of religious traditions, that, those families, either domestic violence doesn't happen or they're more likely to heal. We don't have evidence of that, but what we do know is that those families need all of the resources that a community can offer. We need professional, therapeutic people, we need criminal justice people, we need people in the shelter movement to work together with religious leaders in helping religious couples overcome the violence that's in their lives. And so religious leaders play an important role, as Nancy said, by calling religious perpetrators to accountability and giving religious survivors permission to access the professionals in their community. We're not asking religious leaders to do the job of shelter workers or advocates. We're asking them to refer those who come to them for help to professionals within their community, but also play their role in helping religious women work through some of the spiritual questions that they have, and reinforcing that domestic violence has no place within a religious household.
We have one more question here. This person says, I practice social work in a veterinarian emergency clinic in Ontario. One issue we come across is women bringing in their abused pets only for the veterinarian staff to discover the women themselves are experiencing abuse. Often, women will not leave the home because many shelters do not offer a space for their pets. Did you come across this issue in your study? Were religious leaders involved in addressing these type of obstacles?
Thanks for that question. We haven't specifically spoken or had women speak to us who were concerned about the abuse of their pets, although this is a growing area of research. But what we do know is that people of faith are reluctant to break up the family. There is lots of religious value placed on the family. Women in particular feel responsible for being caregivers in the family. That means keeping the family together, making sure that that initial stained glass portrait of connection and peace and love remains. So they feel a tremendous amount of responsibility. We don't sort of have a position in terms of how that story unfolds, but we do say that all women need to think about their safety and the safety of those that are dependent on them. And so seeking safety means different things to different families. And so for some families, that means putting together a safety plan, reaching out to their social support networks, making sure that they have neighbors who they can call on to watch after their kids, or accompanying them to court or to legal professionals in their community. How the journey unfolds really depends on the individual, but we emphasize safety and working together with professionals in their community.
The other thing I think that is really important to understand is that the needs of women in rural areas and urban areas are not always exactly the same. And so faith communities, of course, are operating in urban environments. They also operate in rural environments. And a faith community often will not only mean a faith leader, but it may mean a variety of groups that women attend. And to the question that you asked, although we've not heard any woman specifically mention that in our focus groups or to us, it is certainly easy for me to imagine that a woman who's part of a women's Bible study in a rural area might be able to ask others in that area to help her with regard to her domestic animals, might be able to help her with ensuring that her animals are safe as well. And so I think, what is really critical for our map of the shelters is so that when a religious leader shows a woman, or a Bible study leader shows a woman what resources are available within a 100-kilometer radius, that's giving a woman permission to seek help at those various places.
Another thing that your question brings up, which I think is really important, is, most survivors don't disclose by saying, I'm living in an abusive relationship or my husband beats me. I mean, it's very rare that we're ever going to have that kind of a disclosure. What we do get is we get hints, we get signs. And so, the presentation of a pet that's been abused is a sign. There are also specific signs or specific ways that religious survivors might speak about the kinds of things that are happening in their homes that is a kind of a code for domestic violence. And so what we also try to do is teach people who are members of religious organizations, whether that's women's groups or congregations, how to recognize some of the coded language that survivors might use. And Nancy, you have a couple of phrases that you like to tell religious leaders.
Well, one thing that often happens when a woman comes to a religious leader is she might say, "Pastor, my life is falling apart." She doesn't say, "Pastor, my husband hurts me, abuses me, has broken my arm." And so helping pastors to realize some of the questions they might ask would be, is it safe for you at home? Are you ever frightened of your husband's anger? Has there been a time when you've needed to leave your home because you feared for yourself or for your children? And one of the ways that we often encourage pastors with regard to this is when they're meeting with couples before marriage. It's called premarital counseling in many religious traditions, and to raise the issue that what might be very happy at this moment at another point in time might be a situation that involves a lot of fear and a lot of despair, and to encourage the woman or the man that the pastoral study, the office of the rabbi, is a safe place later on to disclose that my life is not as I thought it was going to be, and I'm very frightened of my partner. And so harnessing sort of the yearly routine of church life, or harnessing the various points that are important in the life of the congregation are something that a religious leader can do, including putting information in the washroom about the shelter.
I think finally, just in terms of helping people pick up on some of the maybe unique ways in which religious survivors of intimate partner violence might speak, is I'm encouraging public service providers to think about how they could talk to women about some of their religious values. And so one value that women often speak about is their value as mothers, as caregivers in the family. And that's an opportunity for service providers like social workers to ask the woman about their practices of care as a mother and how she is cared for within her family. How does her husband care for her? How is she able to care for her children? Or how in some ways is her ability to care for her children or for her parents hindered by the actions of the husband in the family? And that might also be a doorway into which public service providers can begin to speak to women of faith about their deeply held values, but which may be compromised in situations of family violence.
Well, that's a very good transition to this next question. This person asking is in the same way that society should strive to offer services from a provider to the client in their mother's tongue, do you think there's a place for social workers trained within a specific religion, for instance, a private practitioner from a Catholic perspective, to use that in their intervention?
Well, I think that's a complex question, and I don't think there's just one answer to it. I think what's true for some women is that being able to speak with someone of a like faith tradition is a very important part of their journey of disclosure and the journey in its aftermath of healing. For others, what is really important is to have their story listened to and affirmed, and perhaps an openness to discuss issues of faith, or an openness to make referrals to others who could discuss issues of faith. So I don't think of it, from my point of view, I don't think there's just one way of seeing this. I think what's critical is that in the enthusiasm to condemn violence, sometimes those who are in secular agencies point to the family of faith or the faith tradition as being part of the problem. It may be part of the problem, but it may also be able to be harnessed to be part of the solution.
Oftentimes, Nancy and I talk about our work as the practice of translation. So we try to translate religious ideas, religious concepts, religious practices into a form that public service providers can understand. And part of the way we do that is through the use of visual imagery, which we've shown today. But we also try to translate some of the concepts and practices that come out of public service provision or the feminist movement's response to violence against women into ways that religious folks can understand it from their perspective. And so we're constantly trying to find ways in which to bridge between public service provision and religious organizations and members of those organizations. And so, yeah, as Nancy said, it really depends on the particular circumstances and what that survivor is presenting and which way she wants to move. That said, I think one of the things I've seen in my research working with service providers is that service providers say to me, if the woman presents religion or wants to talk about religion, then I'll talk to her about it. But I don't ever raise religion. And I think about it in terms of a silence. If we don't make it clear in some way that it's acceptable to talk about religion, then the message might be given that we don't talk about religion. It's like I interviewed a service provider once who said that a very clear sign of abuse is choking. And so now in their intake, they're very deliberate about asking survivors about whether or not their partner has choked them. And they're trained to do that. And that made me think, why don't, upon intake, do we ask survivors whether or not religion is important to them? Just by asking the question, then we can send a message to someone who is of faith that it's acceptable or it's okay for them to raise religious issues.
Sometimes in my training with religious leaders, I will pose the question, is your office a safe place to disclose that, my home is violent or that I have been abused? And when I'm doing training with service providers in a secular context, I will then sometimes say, and is your office a safe place to disclose that someone is religious?
Very interesting. Now, I have a question for both of you, if I may. We talk a lot lately about community approach and, integrated approach. And one of the sectors that's never at that table, it seems, is religious leaders. Do you think that's a place for them to sit?
Well, I do, and I think there are some interesting places where that happens. For example, Homefront in Calgary. One of their innovative strategies quite a number of years ago was to help to support a group called FaithLink, which was a interfaith network of individuals who were interested in speaking out against domestic and sexual violence and responding to those who had been impacted by it. So I think it is an important place, but sometimes what's very challenging is that those who are working from a criminal justice perspective or an advocacy perspective or another community-based agency, it's challenging to work with religious leaders who may know a lot of other subjects, but may know very little about domestic violence. And as they work together with maybe 2 or 3 and they help those men and women to understand more, then they're moved to another part of the country. And so now 2 or 3 new people come who may know very little, and the cycle continues. And so there can be a weariness in working in a coordinated community response. But there can also be a synergy that develops. And that synergy can be developed because many religious leaders have access to large numbers of people on a regular basis, and many of those people are keen volunteers in the community, not only in the congregational context, but in other places as well. And so I have seen many innovative activities happen over the years when a particular congregation says on their radar screen, intimate partner violence is an important issue. So, for example, a men's group may volunteer their trucks, one Saturday a month to a shelter. It's so that women who are moving to second stage housing or elsewhere can use those trucks. A series of Sunday school classes produce book bags that are full of school supplies for the end of August or the first week in September. And, a women's group may decide that they want to be engaged in painting a room of the shelter or giving particular items that are required. So I think that as we think bigger and as we think more inclusive, there are lots of ways to both raise awareness in communities of faith and then harness volunteers and others within those communities to see domestic violence and intimate partner violence as one of the issues on which they should be concerned.
Yeah, and I'll just make another shameless plug for our latest book on religion and intimate partner violence, because in that book we outline 4 specific sites in North America where we've looked at this collaborative response and seen how religious leaders are better or worse incorporated, how that dynamic unfolds in 4 specific locations. And it's going to look very different in different places depending upon the individuals who are involved. And so we give a variety of stories of how that's unfolded, and we'd love to hear more. And so we're again interested. If you're interested in watching how things unfold, I encourage you to either like our Facebook page or follow us on Twitter, or you could subscribe to our blog, and you'll see what's going on as our work progresses.
Wonderful, wonderful. We still have a minute or two if anybody would have any questions. But while I'm waiting to see if you have questions, I'll ask Kathy and Nancy if they have a last word they would like to make sure to say today before the end of this presentation.
Well, I think working together in the sandbox is really important. And so in various communities, that's going to happen differently. And so my encouragement would be if you're a social worker in, say, a rural area, think about the kinds of resources and the traditions that might be involved with religious communities there. In fact, just last night, I was working around in my kitchen, and all of a sudden the doorbell rang, and I went to the door, and there were carolers. And the carolers sang, and then they had a little basket where you could give money to the homeless or the food bank. And I thought, what a great collection between a group of people of faith and this time of year. And so my point is just playing in the sandbox can be an advantage for everyone.
Yeah, and I guess I would leave you with a note of encouragement. I've heard from public service providers that they find it difficult to ask people questions about religion, to try to understand the complexity of religion. But I think in my experience, most people are very interested in telling you about their faith and how they live their religion on a daily basis. And so it's not an offensive question to ask somebody, oh, are you a person of faith? And, oh, if they are, what is that like for you? What does that mean? Do you go to a house of worship on a regular basis? Do you eat certain foods? I think this is the kind of curiosity that we as Canadians can cultivate about our neighbors so that we get to know each other better and, more importantly, respond to the social problems in our communities in the most effective way.
As a sociologist of religion, we often talk about lived religion, and what that basically means is how do you practice your faith? And as Kathy says, for those who are people of deep commitment, deep religious commitment, they're often very keen to talk about that. And then you, as a secular worker, can be engaged in helping them to see how they can, harness that at their time of very deep need.
I know it's hard for Kathy and Nancy to see all the good comments I'm receiving online. Your presentation is very well received. Many have thanked you for your great answers, and to also give them another way of thinking. We are, for us that have been working on this issue for so long, it's important to know that we need to work better in that sandbox.
Well, if I could invite you all and thank you for all the work you do, I certainly would do that, because I think that just hats off to those who work in the trenches day after day after day. And I've just really enjoyed this hour of being together.
Yeah, thank you as well, and I wish you a happy holiday. I know that this is a very difficult time of year for many people, and so that means your workload increases, and so all the best to you as we move into the holiday season.
A last comment. I am a social worker at a shelter, and we're not allowed to ask about a person's religion, but keep open dialogue for the client to talk about anything. Last comment for this social worker.
Well, maybe it's time to ask why that is. And we're not advocating any particular faith perspective. We're just advocating that part of cultural competency is understanding that for many people, faith is part of who they are.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Kathy and Nancy. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you for sharing with us. And with that, another sincere thank you to all the audience and for your question and attention. Take care. And on this, happy holidays and goodbye.